What makes a person speak when every second counts, and every word could reset the case? On the brink, Song Yiren breaks silence, allegations in Menglong case stun public. Are these claims the missing links or a final gambit? Join red carpet revealed as we sift the evidence, timelines, and motives, starting now. It began as a sound before it became a sentence, a microphone's brittle squeal. The hush that follows. The thrum of air conditioners keeping their own counsel. The lights behind the press line made a kind of artificial noon as the clock bled toward midnight. Song Yiren stepped into the field of glare. Small in the way a person becomes when the room takes all the oxygen and leaves only decision. Her hands never touched the podium. She stood as if proximity to wood might turn her into a politician. And she needed every syllable to stay immune from that particular gravity. When she spoke, the voice was lower than anyone expected. Without theatrics. The way nerves learn to carry when a person has rehearsed every ruinous outcome and chosen to speak anyway. "I will not die with this in my throat," she said. The cameras leaned forward as if bodies could hear better than lenses. Then the line that made the headlines calcify, events as she described them. And the actors she said were responsible for Menglong's death. Laid out in the careful grammar of allegation. She did not perform a confession. She drew a map, names grouped by function. Verbs that did the heavier lifting than the nouns they clung to, arranged, financed, disseminated, insulated. She repeated an old reporter's admonition. As if borrowing the phrase for moral cover, according to documents. That shielded her from cheap spectacle. And it let anyone listening know the night was not about catharsis. It was about records. Shock travels faster than verification, that is the physics of public life now. Clips hit the feeds before the last question mark left her mouth. But in the room, the rhythm was slower. Older. Counsel for song. Paper neat as a chessboard. Lifted a sealed packet just enough to teach the cameras the lesson of restraint. What matters will be produced to investigators. To court if a court accepts it. Not to strangers who have taught the world to consume grief as content. Across town. Screens blinked awake as editors swapped adjectives, bombshell, explosive, stunning, as if adjectives could be evidence. In the building where consequences are minted. Someone started a chain of custody form. The allegations themselves were not novel in silhouette. Who had read the docket with a pencil already knew the shapes. Which sold as mentorship, money that moved like weather, now falling as sponsorship. Now evaporating into consulting fees, proximity engineered to feel inevitable. A rumor factory with just enough truth in its teeth to cut reputations into saleable strips. What was new was the arrangement. Song named categories before she named people, a communications broker, a financial conduit, a logistical fixer, a shield. She offered dates that matched the calendar's colder memory, travel logs, building access, wire times, and she handed the burden where it belongs, to procedures that do not care how loud a sentence is if it cannot be authenticated. To write about a night like this without losing the reader to adrenaline. To build an honest scaffold. Start with the provenance of every artifact that now threatens to become a symbol. Where did the chants come from? Whose device? Who imaged it? What hash values prove that what we are reading is what existed then? Not what outrage retrofitted later. If there's video. Who held the camera? What encoder's signatures whisper the truth that even pixels cannot hide? Where money looks like motive? Whose ledger keeps time? Which bank codes? Voice numbers. Which deliverables that collapse on contact with questions? Allegation is not an insult in this grammar, it is a promise that the next sentence will be an audit, not a sermon. There is also a human scale that must be honored without becoming appetitive. Menglong's name has been dragged through vectors of speculation that serve the teller more than the told. So keep it simple and exact. He worked. He moved through rooms that changed their temperature when he entered. He endured calendars that leave people hollowed out and easy to move. He navigated requests that were choices in the technical sense, but carried penalties for refusal too expensive for a decent person to bill. He became the axis around which a story bent. And that story has never paid rent to the truth unless it was forced. On the steps, Song's composure was not the point. The point was the move she made from passive to active voice. For months. The case had been a magnet. Collecting filings that rhymed with one another without aligning. She aligned them. Not by declaring certainty but by proposing a testable structure. This is the only adult miracle available to public life, the moment when a person refuses spectacle and offers sequence. She closed with verbs that prevent collapse, preserve the exhibits, protect the witnesses, proceed without theater. Like a prayer written by a clerk. Public shock is a noisy instrument. It will try to substitute for process whenever it can. So the morning after her statement, we measured the shock against the record. Exactly had been added. A set of connections no one had drawn in public. A naming of roles that prosecutors had hinted at in filings by implication. A timetable that made several coincidences behave like choreography. A claim about a meeting everyone said didn't happen and a screenshot of a pass that said someone entered a building when their calendar said otherwise. Nothing more than a guess if it cannot be confirmed, something much heavier if a camera across the street remembers better than human loyalty does. Inside the building where seriousness is the only forgivable vanity, lawyers began to ritualize the night into the day. The first choreographies are always mechanical. Preservation letters to platforms whose engineers will be asked to unzip a history and then swear to it. Subpoenas to contractors whose invoices will be asked to transform into maps. Chain of custody lanes drawn on whiteboards so that a judge will one day be able to order. With a straight face and the quiet confidence that a higher court will not laugh. The system is most elegant when it insists on tedium. Tension you can measure between emotion and evidence that does not require cynicism to feel. A grave sentence, say, a mother's last words on a hospital bed, can be true and yet fragile in court. Some jurisdictions honor dying declarations. Restrict them to a narrow throat of admissibility. Require corroboration. Even the most devastating line must survive the two questions that make the law decent. Is this what it claims to be, and does it move the fact we are asked to decide? Song, carefully, did not lean on poetry. She anchored her night in nouns that behave under oath. A case like this tempts the public to choose teams. Song made a different ask, choose standards. She said her piece and then said what would happen next. Investigators would receive devices. Independent experts would be allowed to rerun the hash checks. Forensic auditors would be invited to trace transfers that pretended not to know one another. Anyone named would be offered a right of reply. Defense would be treated not as antagonists but as instruments of rigor. If the record rejected her claims, she would accept it. The record confirmed them. Consequence would be asked to stop being the performative version and become the version that hurts. It ended without a curtain. The cameras lost interest when the verbs stopped being dramatic. In a smaller room, an officer walked a family to a car and reminded them that visibility is its own sort of armor. In another, a clerk printed 2 extra copies of the minute order because you never want to trust only the digital thing. In a third, an assistant turned a phone face down on a stack of transcripts so that 3 lines could be underlined without distraction. This is how the next day becomes possible. Dawn opens courtrooms with the indifferent elegance of routine. The calendar is called. The sides announce themselves. Microphone coughs into its hand. If part 1 belonged to a sentence and its echo, part 2 belongs to the only ritual that can rescue meaning from noise, hearing, verifying, admitting, excluding. Each verb is a gate. Each gate has a key. None of the keys are forged from adjectives. The first gate is authenticity. Digital evidence pretends to be simple because it is clean. It is not simple. A chat export has a birth certificate, the device that produced it. The software that translated it into a printable thing. Signature that proves a human did not sculpt it into a better vessel for outrage. A video file carries a fingerprint, encoder signatures, bitrates. The sonic stray hairs that spectrograms learn to spot. A bank transfer whispers in bank dialect, Swift tags, reference codes. The bureaucratic poetry of compliance teams. The court does not need to love any of this. It needs to be able to say, with a straight face, the thing and the name the thing is called are the same. The second gate is relevance. Some museums with ruthless curators. They do not hang every painting that wants a wall. The standard sounds humble. Does this make a fact that matters a little more or less likely? But it is the wall that keeps the room from drowning. One's map will need to prove its pieces talk to one another. Not just wave across the street. That a wire and a calendar invite and a travel receipt and a message must rhyme in a way that makes coincidence an inferior hypothesis. Then comes the hardest gate. Rule 403 balance. The probative value must outweigh the risk of unfair prejudice. The words unfair and prejudice are not synonyms for painful to read. Instructions to a culture that likes to decide first and edit later. A judge will trim where trimming preserves the signal. The prosecutor will hold back the frame that makes the jury hate a person for reasons unrelated to the elements. A good defense will resist the temptation to pretend ambiguity is proof of innocence rather than proof that the state must do more work. The bench will instruct like a parent who trusts their children with the sharp knives because they have earned it. Song's allegations are already learning to walk this path. Opponent, whether the state or a civil plaintiff, will want to argue pattern without triggering the allergy appellate courts have to propensity. The defense will want to isolate each act until it starves of context. The court will have to find the grammar that lets the record do both things at once. Prevent the past from functioning as prophecy while allowing a timeline to behave like time. Parallel to these ceremonies runs the river the public watches because it knows how to splash there, platforms, press, and the appetite that confuses attention with significance. River can drown a case, or it can irrigate the field where documents grow. Distinction is not philosophical, it is practical. A newsroom that treats every clip as a prompt to ask where is the docket number, trains the city to become useful. A platform that labels artifacts with provenance rather than opinion decreases the market value of falsity. Moderators who ban doxing as if it were a pollutant rather than a pastime make it possible for witnesses to appear without helmets. What follows from a night like the one on the steps should not be myth, it should be minutes. Minutes that turn into orders. Orders that harden into obligations. Obligations that calendars can enforce. If Song's map survives authentication and relevance. If it adds weight to counts that otherwise float. Remedies become arithmetic rather than poetry. Solution is not a vibe, it is a number with a deadline. Junctions are not announcements, they are fences that make trespass expensive. Monitors, however boring. Heroes of any story that decides to become a policy rather than a cautionary tale. Appeals ever like weather over all of this. Not retrials, they are audits. They ask whether the gates were honored in spirit as well as in keystroke. If a trial court lets a story wear a mask of proof without the papers to justify it, a panel will send the case back with the kind of tenderness the law shows only when it is ashamed of its children. If the trial court writes with a nib fine enough to survive scrutiny, the panel will not in prose that sounds like granite. Either way, the work is in the paragraphs, not the press conferences. Safety continues alongside due process because bodies cannot be asked to pause while paper moves. Families and witnesses will be protected not because they are right, but because the system is decent when it remembers what it is for. Protective orders will be served. Violations will be enforced. Police will appear when someone who likes chaos more than consequence tries to export their will into someone else's house. Platforms will escalate threats along lanes designed for violence, not vibes. Communities will rediscover the old art of being neighbors who see and say without turning vigilance into a militia. Money will continue to tell the truth it always tells, where the will was, where the fear lived, where pressure traveled when it hired a car. Coordination is proven. It will look boring in the filings, invoices pretending to be heir. Entities with names only clerks can love. If coordination is not proven, a different kind of lesson will emerge, that culture does not need conspiracies to behave like one. That a chorus of uncoordinated cruelty can still harmonize. Either lesson implies responsibility. Neither permits cynicism as absolution. Two stories from other dockets echo here like parables. In one, a late-stage allegation arrived with the heat of a comet and burned out on contact with a gate, the court explained. In footnotes finer than applause. Sincerity is not a standard of proof. The second traveled the opposite road, an unfashionable piece of evidence. Authenticated to the point of tedium. Moved a case an inch at a time until the verdict spoke in the register of dignity. The appeal in the first case became a warning. Appeal in the second became a rubric. Song's night is the rare chance to choose its ancestor. What does justice look like if this proceeds with courage and care? It does not look like a montage. It looks like a sequence you can teach. If the record corroborates enough of Song's map, counts may be charged or judgments entered. Some people will pay money, others will lose privileges they thought were rights. A few will face the inside of rooms where locks announce themselves. If the record corroborates partially, reforms and sanctions will do the kind of work that headlines pretend is boring and history remembers as decisive. The record rejects the map. The culture will be asked to hold both grief and restraint without converting either into a weapon. The hardest sentence to carry out of nights like these is also the most adult. Allegations can stun, only evidence should decide. It is a sentence built like a bridge, steel under the asphalt of empathy. It does not ask you to stop feeling. It asks you to refuse to let feeling choose for you. Song Yiren. If she is to be remembered well for this night. Be remembered not for igniting a crowd but for reteaching a city how to read. When the building empties and the cameras sleep. People who keep the promise of process do unglamorous things. A janitor pulls a bag heavy with drafts that lost the argument to a better paragraph. A clerk affixes a seal to a page that will one day be cited by someone who has not been born. A deputy walks the dark hallway once. Twice. 3 times. Because habit is where safety lives. Somewhere. A mother who heard her name taken in vain by strangers all day finally lays phone face down and stares at a ceiling that looks more honest than any screen. The night song Yiren broke her silence is not an ending. Not even a beginning. Exactly. It is a hinge. What it will hold depends on whether the people who woke up electric from it choose to become better citizens of the record or better consumers of each other. If you need a line to carry with you until the next filing posts, carry this. Breaking silence begins a story, corroboration earns its ending. Song Yiren's midnight statement changed the temperature, not the standard. Allegations shocked the public. But only authenticated records, careful rulings, and enforceable remedies can carry the weight of truth. If this moment matters, it's because it moved the story from slogans to exhibits, from clips to chain of custody, outrage to outcomes that survive appeal. Let the claims point, let corroboration decide. Thank you for reading with patience and care. Your attention, measured in rigor, not clicks, creates space for survivor-centered reporting, fair defense, and a justice process that can do its precise, unglamorous work. Stay with us for verified updates as filings, hearings, and enforcement unfold.